On Thanksgiving, my son sat me in a child's chair in the corner while the whole family sat at the big table. I smiled silently and took out my phone. The next morning, he discovered that the locks on his house had been changed. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house when the people you loved most have quietly decided you are no longer necessary. I know that silence well now. But back then, before Thanksgiving, before the locks, before all of it, I mistook it for peace. My name is Margaret Harlow. Most people who matter to me call me Margie. I am 68 years old, a retired attorney, and for the better part of 4 decades, I built a life that I was genuinely proud of. I raised Daniel on my own after his father, Robert, passed from a heart attack in 1999. I worked double hours at the firm to keep the mortgage paid and Daniel in good schools. I attended every single one of his baseball games, even the rainy Tuesday ones in October when there were 6 people in the bleachers. I put him through college. I co-signed his first car loan. And when he and Christina got married and decided they wanted a house in Millbrook, a town where the average home price would have made their salaries weep, I quietly transferred $140,000 of my savings as a gift toward the down payment. No paperwork, no loan agreement, because he was my son, and that is what mothers do. For a while, things were good. Sunday dinners, birthday calls, holidays that felt like holidays. Christina was never warm exactly, but she was polite, and I told myself that was enough. She came from a family where emotion was treated like a liability, and I tried to be understanding about that. Their daughter, my granddaughter Emma, was born in 2018, and for a year or two, Emma was the bridge that kept us connected in a genuine way. I babysat twice a week. I read to her. I taught her how to make my mother's apple pie from scratch. But somewhere around 2021, things began to shift. Small things at first, the kind you explain away because you don't want to be the difficult mother-in-law. My Sunday dinner invitations started coming later and later, sometimes only the day before, as if I were an afterthought rather than family. When I arrived, Christina had a habit of redirecting conversations I was part of, talking over me with the particular smoothness of someone who has practiced the gesture. Daniel never corrected her. He would sit at the head of the table with a look I can only describe as carefully neutral. The face of a man who has made a private agreement with himself not to notice certain things. Then there were the comments, subtle enough to deny. Christina once remarked in front of Daniel and 2 of their friends that it must be freeing to live alone at my age. No responsibilities, no one to answer to. She smiled when she said it. The friends laughed politely. I smiled back. But I drove home that evening and sat in my kitchen for a long time, turning the comment over in my hands like a stone with a sharp edge hidden underneath. Was I being oversensitive? That was always the question I asked myself in those months. Was I the problem? The calls from Daniel grew shorter. When I mentioned my health, nothing serious, just the ordinary maintenance of an aging body, a knee that had started complaining on stairs. He listened with the distracted patience of someone waiting for a topic to end. Christina stopped including me in Emma's school events. I found out about my granddaughter's first dance recital 3 days after it happened from a photograph Emma's teacher posted in the parent group that a neighbor happened to screenshot and send me. I should have understood then what was happening, but we protect ourselves from what we don't want to know. The understanding came on Thanksgiving. I arrived at Daniel and Christina's house at noon, as invited, with a pecan pie I had baked from scratch and a small wrapped gift for Emma. The house was warm and smelled of roasting turkey, and for approximately 4 minutes, I allowed myself to believe it would be a good day. The dining table was set beautifully. Christina had outdone herself. Linen napkins, candles, the good china. 12 people seated. Daniel's in-laws, 2 of Christina's girlfriends and their husbands, a couple from the neighborhood I barely knew, and Emma in a velvet dress. There was no place set for me at the table. Christina appeared from the kitchen with the practiced timing of a stage director. "Oh, Margie," she said, touching my arm with 2 fingers. "I hope you don't mind. We were a little tight on space." She gestured toward the corner of the room, near the window that faced the backyard. There, against the wall, was a small wooden chair, the kind designed for a child of perhaps 4 years old. Next to it was a folding tray table. I looked at my son. Daniel was looking at his phone. I stood in that doorway for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I could feel 12 pairs of eyes conduct the subtle gymnastics of people pretending not to watch. I heard Emma say, from her seat at the big table, "Grandma, why are you sitting over there?" No one answered her. I smiled, a real, steady, unhurried smile. I walked to the small chair, set my pecan pie on the kitchen counter without comment, and sat down. I straightened my back. I took out my phone. And while the family laughed and passed the stuffing and filled their glasses at the long table 10 feet away from me, I opened my notes app and began to type. Not a text. Not a complaint to a friend. I typed 3 words at the top of an empty page. What do I own? I drove home from Millbrook in the dark, the pecan pie on the passenger seat. Christina had not touched it, and I had taken it back without a word. The highway was quiet. The radio was off. I needed to think, and I think best in silence. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, I had moved past the humiliation. That surprised me, actually. I had expected grief or tears, or the specific ache of a mother who has been rejected by her child. I felt none of that on the drive home. What I felt was clarity. The cold, clean clarity of a woman who spent 31 years practicing law and had learned the hard way that feelings are useful data, but terrible strategies. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning with a yellow legal pad and a glass of water. What did I own, exactly? My own home, a 3-bedroom Craftsman on Alderswood Lane that was paid off in full and titled solely in my name. A retirement account, a modest investment portfolio Robert and I had built together, which I had continued to manage after his death. And then there was the $140,000. I had given that money to Daniel without documentation. No gift letter, no promissory note, no record beyond a wire transfer notation in my bank statement that read D. Harlow, house. At the time, I hadn't wanted the paperwork. It had felt cold, legalistic, inappropriate between a mother and son. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen at 1 in the morning, I understood exactly how that decision looked from the outside, like an old woman who had voluntarily handed over a significant asset to her adult child with no legal protection whatsoever. I wrote that down on the legal pad. Then I wrote the next item, my will. I had drafted it 8 years ago, shortly after Robert died. I had left everything to Daniel. The house, the accounts, everything. I had not revised it since. I had not thought to revise it because, and here I paused and made myself sit with the honesty of it, because I had never, until that evening, allowed myself to believe that Daniel was capable of what I had just witnessed. But what had I witnessed exactly? That was the question I needed to be precise about. I had been seated at a child's chair while my family ate Thanksgiving dinner at a proper table 10 feet away. That was the fact. The interpretation, cruelty, conspiracy, a coordinated effort to diminish and isolate me, was still a theory. And I was a lawyer long enough to know the distance between fact and theory. Was it possible this was Christina's doing alone, and Daniel had simply failed to stop it? Yes. Was it possible there was something larger happening? A deliberate strategy to push me out of their lives while keeping access to what I could offer financially? Also possible. What I needed was not more emotion. What I needed was evidence. I made a second column on the legal pad. What I need to find out. Had Daniel changed any of his financial or legal documents recently? Had Christina made any comments to mutual acquaintances about my mental acuity, my health, my ability to manage on my own? Had there been any moves, however small, to involve anyone else in the management of my affairs? I thought of a comment Daniel had made in August, casually, over coffee, about whether I had thought about simplifying my finances. I had assumed he meant consolidating accounts. Now I wrote it down and underlined it. I was not going to make accusations. I was not going to confront them in anger. I was not going to call Daniel at midnight and demand an explanation for a child's chair in a corner, because that was exactly the kind of behavior that could later be described by a persuasive person as erratic. I was going to be methodical. The first step was my will. I would call my attorney, Catherine Webb, who had worked alongside me at the firm years ago and was someone I trusted completely. First thing Monday morning. The will needed to be reviewed and very likely revised. That was not a punishment or a declaration of war. That was responsible estate planning, and it was something I should have done years ago regardless. The second step was documentation. Every interaction with Daniel and Christina going forward would be noted. Date, time, who was present, what was said. Not obsessively. I was not going to wire my kitchen, but the kind of quiet, consistent record-keeping that I had taught junior associates to practice in the early days of a litigation. You document before you need the documentation, not after. The third step was the money. $140,000, transferred without a paper trail. I needed to understand my legal position. Whether that transfer could be characterized as a loan, whether I had any recourse, whether its absence from documentation created a vulnerability for me. I put down the pen at 1:47 a.m. and looked at what I had written. Was I being paranoid? Perhaps. A small, exhausted part of me still wanted that to be the explanation. But I had spent 3 decades watching people's behavior in high-stress situations, and I knew something about the architecture of cruelty. It rarely starts with a dramatic gesture. It starts with small, deniable things. A chair in a corner, a tone of voice, a missing invitation, that accumulate until the target doubts their own perception. I was not going to doubt mine. I rinsed my glass, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning was a Saturday. I woke early, made coffee, and drove to Daniel's house in Millbrook. I had a key, or rather, I had always assumed I had a key, because Daniel had given me one 4 years ago in case of emergencies. The key did not work. I stood on my son's front porch in the November cold, trying the lock twice, and then I understood something with the certainty of a woman who has stopped explaining things away. The locks had been changed. I walked back to my car, sat down, and added one line to my legal pad, which I had brought with me out of habit. They changed the locks before I could. Then I drove home and called Catherine. Catherine Webb had the kind of office that reminded you law was serious business. Dark wood shelves, framed diplomas, the permanent smell of coffee and old paper. She had been practicing estate law for 30 years, and she had a manner I always admired, unhurried, precise, and entirely unbothered by drama. When I called her Saturday morning, she told me to come Monday at 10. I was there at 9:55. I told her everything: the chair, the locks, the $140,000, the will, the comment Daniel had made in August about simplifying my finances. I spoke the way I used to brief senior partners, chronologically, without editorializing, presenting facts and flagging inferences clearly. Catherine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her pen in her fingers. "Margie," she said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to hear it as a legal question, not a personal one." "Go ahead." "Has Daniel, or Christina, ever suggested to you, formally or informally, that they should have any role in managing your finances or your healthcare decisions?" I thought of August, of Daniel's casual question about simplifying. "Once," I said, in a way that felt casual at the time. Catherine nodded slowly. "And you have no documentation of the $140,000 transfer as a gift rather than a loan? None beyond the wire transfer record?" She set her pen down. "Then here's what we're going to do." We revised my will entirely that morning, a process I should have initiated years ago. Catherine drafted the changes on the spot, using the notes I had brought, and we scheduled a formal signing for Wednesday. The new document removed Daniel as sole beneficiary. In his place, I named a charitable trust I had long supported, Emma's Education Fund, as a protected direct bequest, and Catherine herself as executor. Daniel would receive a modest specific bequest, enough that the revision could not be characterized as the product of mental incapacity or sudden spite, but nothing that gave him leverage over my estate. The second thing we addressed was the $140,000. Catherine reviewed the wire transfer record I had photographed and emailed her that morning. Her assessment was careful but clear. While the transfer had no explicit loan documentation, the circumstances, the timing, the amount, the direct connection to the home purchase, could support a legal claim that it was a loan if I chose to pursue that characterization. It would not be simple. It would require litigation. But the option existed. "I'm not asking you to sue your son today," Catherine said. "I'm asking you to understand that the option is real." I understood. I left Catherine's office feeling lighter, not happy, but purposeful, which is better. I had taken the first concrete step. The will was being revised. My legal position was being assessed. I was no longer reacting. I was acting. What I did not anticipate was how quickly Daniel would notice. I found out later, from Emma, of all people, during a brief phone call the following week, that Christina had driven past Catherine's office building on Tuesday afternoon. Not deliberately, Emma said. She had been in the car and pointed out Grandma's friend's office when they passed it. Christina had gone very quiet, Emma told me, and then asked how Emma knew it was my friend's office. I had mentioned Catherine to Emma once, over pie, months ago. Children remember everything. By Wednesday, the day I signed my revised will, Daniel had called me twice. I did not answer. He left a voicemail the second time, his voice carrying a particular careful brightness that I recognized from his childhood as the tone he used when he was worried about something but didn't want to show it. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. Haven't heard from you since Thanksgiving. Hope you're doing okay. Give me a call." No mention of the chair. No mention of the locks. No apology. I saved the voicemail and did not call back. The direct evidence came on Thursday. My neighbor Linda, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door to me for 11 years and with whom I had a standing Thursday morning coffee arrangement, handed me a folded piece of paper when I arrived at her door. Her expression was the careful one people wear when they are about to say something they wish they didn't have to say. "I wasn't sure whether to show you this," she said, "but I decided I would want to know." It was a printout of a private Facebook message that Linda's daughter, who worked at the same gym as Christina, had screenshot and sent to her mother. In it, Christina was writing to her own sister. I will not reproduce the entire message here. What I will say is that it contained 3 things I needed to see. First, Christina referred to me as getting confused lately and suggested to her sister that I had become a liability who needed someone to keep an eye on her finances before she does something she'll regret. Second, she mentioned, in passing, that she and Daniel had spoken to a financial advisor about the possibility of getting power of attorney set up while things are still uncomplicated. Third, she described the Thanksgiving seating arrangement as completely intentional and said, and this is the part I read 3 times, the more isolated she feels, the more she'll want to lean on us, and then we can actually do something useful with that situation. I sat at Linda's kitchen table and read that message twice more. Then I folded it carefully, put it in my coat pocket, and drank my coffee. "Are you all right?" Linda asked. "I am," I said, and I meant it. I just needed to know what I was actually dealing with. I drove directly to a copy shop on the way home and had the message photocopied 3 times. 1 copy went into a folder in my filing cabinet. 1 copy went into a sealed envelope I mailed that afternoon to Catherine's office. The third I kept in my purse. That evening, I sat in my living room in the quiet and thought about what I now knew. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a difficult daughter-in-law with poor manners. This was a plan, deliberate, discussed, documented in Christina's own words, to isolate me, manufacture an image of me as cognitively declining, and use that image to take control of my finances. Power of attorney. While things are still uncomplicated. My hands were steady. My breath was even. And somewhere in the part of me that had spent 31 years in courtrooms, a door clicked shut with the soft final sound of a case that had just become winnable. The following Monday, I called my bank. Not to close accounts, not yet. That was not the move. The move was to speak with the branch manager personally, a woman named Helen Marsh, whom I had known for several years through a local women's civic group, and to request a formal review of all account beneficiary designations and any third-party access permissions attached to my accounts. I wanted to know, in writing, exactly who had access to what, and to ensure that no changes could be made without my direct in-person authorization, 2 forms of ID, and a 48-hour notification period. Helen was professional and thorough. There were no unauthorized changes on file, but she confirmed that someone had called the bank's general inquiry line the previous week, asking about the process for adding an authorized user to a senior account holder's checking account. The call had been made from a number registered to Daniel Harlow. She showed me the notation in the system. I asked for a printed copy. She provided it. I also, that week, called Dr. Angela Ferraro, my primary care physician of 12 years, and scheduled a full cognitive evaluation. Not because I had any concerns about my mental acuity, but because if Christina intended to build a narrative around my confusion and declining judgment, I wanted a clean, dated, professionally administered counterargument already on file. Dr. Ferraro administered the evaluation herself on Wednesday. I scored in the top percentile for my age group across every category. She gave me a written summary on clinic letterhead. I had it laminated. Catherine, meanwhile, had sent Daniel a formal letter. It was not aggressive. It did not mention the Facebook message or the bank inquiry. It simply notified him, as my attorney, that my estate planning documents had been updated, that the $140,000 transfer to his home purchase was being formally reclassified in my records as a no-interest personal loan with an open repayment timeline, and that any future discussions regarding my finances or healthcare decisions should be directed to Catherine's office in writing. The letter arrived at Daniel's house on a Thursday. He called me 17 times between Thursday evening and Friday noon. I answered on the 18th call. "Mom." His voice was low and controlled in the way it got when he was furious, but trying to sound calm. "What is this letter?" "Standard estate planning communication," I said. "Catherine handles all correspondence of that nature." "You're calling the down payment money a loan now? We never discussed a loan?" "We never discussed a gift either," I said. Nothing was documented. Catherine felt it was prudent to clarify. There was a pause. I could hear Christina in the background, her voice too low to make out the words, but the tone unmistakable. That tight, rapid murmur of someone stage directing a conversation. "I need to see you," Daniel said. "In person. We need to talk about this. You're welcome to call Catherine's office and schedule a meeting. She can be present as a neutral party." "I don't want a lawyer present. I want to talk to my mother." "Then write me a letter," I said pleasantly. "I find that format clarifies things." I hung up. They arrived at my house the following Saturday morning without calling ahead. I was in the garden when I heard the car in the drive. That particular sound of a vehicle stopping too quickly. I took off my gloves, folded them into my jacket pocket, and walked around to the front of the house. Daniel stood at my front door. Christina was 2 steps behind him, her face arranged in an expression I can only describe as performed concern. She was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. "We wanted to check on you," Christina said. I looked at the casserole. I looked at her face. 31 years of reading witnesses in depositions. "I'm fine," I said. "Thank you for coming by." I did not open the door. Daniel stepped forward. His voice dropped lower, which was meant to sound intimate. "Mom, I don't know what Catherine has told you or what you think is happening, but this letter, this whole thing, it's not necessary. We want to take care of you. That's all Christina and I have ever wanted." "The letter is necessary," I said. "It's good documentation." "Documentation." He repeated the word as if I'd said something offensive. "You're treating your family like a legal case." "I'm treating my finances like finances," I said. "Which is what they are." Christina set the casserole on the porch railing, a prop she had apparently forgotten what to do with, and took a small step forward. "Margie." Her voice was softer now, a register I hadn't heard before. "We're worried about you. You've been alone since Thanksgiving. You're not returning calls. You're making legal changes without talking to us first. We just want to understand what's happening with you." What's happening with you? The language of concern weaponized as diagnosis. "Nothing is happening with me," I said evenly. "I revised my will. I spoke to my bank. I had a cognitive evaluation. Everything is in perfect order." I paused. "Would you like the contact information for Dr. Ferraro's office? She can confirm." Christina's performed concern flickered for just a moment. A tightening around the eyes, quickly smoothed. Daniel changed tactics. He stepped closer, and his voice went quiet and hard in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager fighting about a curfew. "Mom, I need you to understand something. If you keep pushing this lone narrative, if you keep involving lawyers in family business, there will be consequences for our relationship. You'll be making a choice." There it was. The threat I had been waiting for, dressed up as concern. "I hear you," I said. "Do you?" "Clearly." I held his gaze for a moment, then stepped back toward my front door. "Thank you for coming by, Daniel." "Christina." I looked at the casserole. "You can take that with you." I went inside, locked the door, and stood in my hallway until I heard the car back out of the driveway. Then I sat down on the hallway bench, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I cried. Briefly, quietly, in the way of someone releasing pressure rather than giving into it. Because he was still my son. That part had not stopped being true, and it probably never would. But I had heard what he said, and I had noted the time and the date and the specific words' consequences for our relationship, which I wrote down in my log that afternoon in full. I gave myself 3 days after that. I went to the shore, a small inn in Cape Cod that Robert and I had loved, where I walked the November beach and ate good chowder and slept long and dreamlessly. I read 2 novels I'd been putting off. I called an old friend in Portland and talked for 2 hours about everything except Daniel. By the time I drove home, The pressure in my chest had settled into something harder and quieter. Not anger. Resolve. I returned from Cape Cod on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, I had 2 missed calls from Christina's personal cell number, not Daniel's, hers, and a handwritten note in my mailbox. The note was on cream-colored stationery, her handwriting careful and even, the kind people use when they want something to look sincere. It said she was sorry if Thanksgiving had felt unwelcoming, that she had been overwhelmed managing the seating and the cooking, that she hoped I knew how much she and Daniel valued having me in their lives, and that she would love to take me to lunch, somewhere nice, just us 2 girls to clear the air. I read it at my kitchen table with my coffee. Then I read it again. It was well crafted. I'll give her that. The apology was technically present. Sorry if Thanksgiving had felt unwelcoming, which is the grammatical structure of an apology that accepts no responsibility. The warmth was calibrated. The invitation to lunch, just us 2 girls, was designed to separate me from Catherine, from Linda, from any witness. A private conversation where anything said could later be denied. I wrote back the same afternoon. A short, polite note on plain white paper, thanking her for writing, noting that I was quite well and not in need of clearing any air, and suggesting that if she had things she wished to communicate, she was welcome to do so through Catherine's office, as that ensured everything stayed clear for everyone. I mailed it before dinner. The calls from Daniel slowed after that. Not stopped. He called once on Sunday, a voicemail that was gentle in tone, almost the voice of my son as he had been at 25, before Christina, before the house and the money and the careful calculations that had replaced the easier love of earlier years. He said he missed me. He said he hoped I was eating well. He said Emma had asked about me. I played the voicemail twice. I wrote in my log. Tone shift. Softer approach. Likely strategic. Note Emma's name used. And then I did something that surprised even me. I called Emma directly. She was 7 years old and delighted to hear from me. We talked for 20 minutes about her hamster, whose name was apparently Biscuit, and about a book series she was reading, and about whether apple pie or pecan pie was superior. Emma voted apple. I told her she had excellent taste. She laughed and asked when I was coming to visit. Soon, I told her, and I meant it in the way I meant all the things I was planning, carefully, deliberately, on a timeline I controlled. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the particular bittersweetness of loving a child who was also caught in someone else's war. Emma was not responsible for her parents. She was not a pawn in my strategy. Whatever happened between Daniel and me, my relationship with my granddaughter would be protected. I made a note to speak to Catherine about the specific language in the will regarding Emma's education fund. I wanted it structured so that no action Daniel or Christina took could ever reach it. The social support I found was not dramatic. It was not a group of allies rallying around me with strategy sessions and war councils. It was quieter and more sustaining than that. Linda was the first and most constant. We had coffee every Thursday regardless, and she was a practical woman who had survived her own family ruptures and came to these conversations not with pity, but with the steadiness of someone who understood that difficult situations require witness more than advice. She never told me what to do. She listened. She remembered. And when I needed a second set of eyes on something I'd written or received, she provided them without drama. The second was an unexpected one. Patricia Owens, who I had worked alongside at the firm in the mid-90s before she moved to a family law practice. We had not been close in years, but I called her on a Wednesday evening on an impulse, told her broadly what was happening, and she responded with the directness of a woman who has spent decades in family courts. The power of attorney angle is the one that worries me most, she said. If they pursue that, and they find a willing doctor or a compromised evaluation, you are in a much harder position than you are now. I have Dr. Ferraro's evaluation on file, I said. Dated. Good. Get a second one. Different doctor. Make the record airtight. A pause. Margie, I've seen this pattern. Not always this deliberately, sometimes it's more confused and well-intentioned than it looks. But the structure you're describing, the social isolation, the narrative of cognitive decline, the financial access probe, that's a recognizable pattern. You're doing the right things. Don't stop. I wrote her words down after we hung up. You're doing the right things. Don't stop. There was a particular evening, a Friday in mid-December, when I sat in my living room with the lights low and the snow beginning outside, and thought about what my life had looked like a year ago versus now. A year ago, I had spent Friday evenings quietly certain that my son loved me, that my family was intact, that the ordinary diminishments of age were the only things I needed to navigate. That certainty was gone. And strangely, I did not miss it the way I had expected to. False certainty is its own kind of loneliness. What I had now, clarity, documentation, 2 women who told me the truth, a granddaughter who asked about pie, felt more solid than the comfortable fog of before. Daniel and Christina were quiet that week. The calls had stopped. Linda's daughter reported from the gym that Christina had been tightly pleasant in the way people are when they are waiting for something. Observing, recalibrating. Let them recalibrate, I thought. I had an appointment with Catherine scheduled for December 22nd. We were going to review the $140,000 documentation and discuss next steps. I had a second cognitive evaluation booked with a neurologist Catherine had recommended, entirely independent of Dr. Ferraro, clean and formal and beyond question. I had my log, now running to 11 pages of dated entries, stored in 3 separate locations, including a cloud drive that only Catherine and I could access. I was not finished, not even close. But I slept well. I ate my meals at my own table. And on Sunday mornings I baked, because I had always baked on Sunday mornings, and I saw no reason to let someone else's scheming take that from me, too. They came 3 days before Christmas. I had not invited them. I was in the kitchen rolling out pie dough when I heard the car, and I recognized the sound of Daniel's engine before I looked out the window. They pulled into the driveway in the early afternoon, both of them, and Emma was with them. Emma in a red coat with white buttons, carrying a wrapped present, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. They had brought Emma deliberately. I understood that immediately, and with no particular bitterness, because understanding a move does not require you to respect it. I opened the door before they knocked. Emma threw herself at me with the uncalculated joy of a 7-year-old who hadn't seen her grandmother in weeks, and I held her and breathed in the smell of her hair and let that be what it was. Real, uncomplicated, mine. "We thought we'd bring your gift in person," Daniel said. His voice was warm, carefully warm, the way a room is warm when someone has turned the thermostat up right before guests arrive. "Come in," I said. We sat in the living room. Emma found a ceramic mouse on the mantel and was absorbed. I made tea. Daniel sat in Robert's old armchair, and for a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. Emma's school play, the snow forecast, the neighbor's new dog. Christina sat with her hands folded in her lap, waiting. It was Christina who moved first. She set her teacup down with deliberate care. "Margie," she said, "I want to be honest with you." She let that land for a moment. "I know things between us have been strained. I know Thanksgiving wasn't what any of us wanted." She glanced at Daniel, who nodded. "I take responsibility for that. I was overwhelmed, and I made a poor decision that hurt you, and I'm sorry." "Thank you," I said. "We've been doing a lot of talking," Daniel added, "about what we want our family to look like, about what's important." He leaned forward. "Mom, We want you in our lives, not as an obligation, as family. The word obligation was interesting. I filed it. What we were hoping, Christina continued, is that we could start fresh. Put the legal stuff aside, the letters, the attorney involvement, and just talk, as a family, about what we all need. She tilted her head slightly. Because I think when you're operating through lawyers, it makes everyone feel like they're under suspicion. There it was. Put the legal stuff aside. Return to a situation where the only record of $140,000 was a wire notation and good faith. I understand, I said. Daniel's face relaxed, too quickly. And I want to be honest with you too, I continued pleasantly. I will always have legal representation involved in my financial affairs. That isn't going to change. A beat of silence. Mom. Daniel's voice lost its warmth. We're not asking you to act against your interests. We're asking you to treat us like family, not an opposing party. You are family, I said. Catherine's involvement doesn't change that. Christina smiled thinly. Margie, I think the problem is that you've become, and I say this with love, isolated. You're spending time with people who encourage this adversarial framing. Linda, this attorney. They don't know what we actually want for you. Isolated. Her own word from the Facebook message. I find that I have very good company, I said. Daniel stood. He was a tall man when he stood, and I think he knew that. He was not threatening me. He was simply choosing to be tall. Let me be very clear, he said quietly. If you pursue this loan claim and keep treating me like a suspect in your own estate, you are going to drive a permanent wedge through this family. Emma will grow up watching her grandmother treat her father like an enemy. Is that the legacy you want to leave? Emma had gone still near the mantel. She was listening, in the way children listen when they sense something they can't name. Emma, sweetheart, go get yourself a cookie from the kitchen. The snowflake one's on the counter. She went. I waited until I heard her footsteps. Then I turned back to Daniel. I love you, I said. But I am not going to be frightened into making financial decisions by a speech about legacy. I stood. I think it's time for you to go. Christina's face went tight and cold, the mask finally off. She was on her feet in one motion, looked at me with focused fury, then composed herself. You'll regret this, she said simply. I'll get Emma's coat, I said. They left. Emma hugged me at the door and asked if I was okay. I told her I loved her and that we would have pie soon. I watched the car until it turned out of sight. Then I leaned against the closed door and felt it. Real fear. A tightness in the sternum, uneven breathing. Christina's last 3 words had not been theatrical. They had been precise. But fear, properly understood, is information. It tells you what is at stake. And what was at stake here? My granddaughter, my autonomy, my right to spend the rest of my life on my own terms, was worth every bit of it. I walked to my desk and opened my log. December 22nd. Daniel and Christina visit unannounced. Emma present. Christina apologizes, language of no-fault apology. Requests removal of legal oversight. Daniel uses Emma as leverage, references legacy. Christina on departure. You'll regret this. Emma witnessed portion of exchange. I underlined the last line. Then I called Catherine. The meeting happened on January 8th. Catherine had suggested a formal settlement conference. Daniel, Christina, their attorney, Catherine, and me. One meeting. Everything on the table. I spent the week before it quietly. I reviewed my documentation. I organized the folder into a clean, tabbed binder. The wire transfer record, the bank inquiry notation, the authenticated Facebook message, the preserved Instagram photographs, both cognitive evaluations, the 11-page log, the voicemails, the letter in which Daniel had referenced consequences for our relationship. I had a new will, a clean financial record, and Christina's own words describing a deliberate strategy of isolation. What I did not bring was anger. Anger is expensive. It makes you imprecise, and imprecision is what the other side counts on. Daniel and Christina arrived 15 minutes late. They had brought their own attorney, Gerald Park, whom Catherine described as competent but not exceptional. Daniel was in a suit, slightly too formal for the occasion, which told me he was nervous. Christina was in a charcoal blazer, controlled, the Facebook message far from her mind. Or so she thought. Gerald Park opened with a brief statement about his client's desire to resolve a family misunderstanding. He used the word misunderstanding 3 times in 4 minutes. Catherine laid out my position methodically. Formal documentation of the loan, updated estate documents, transparent management of my financial affairs. Then she opened the folder. We also want to address a separate matter relevant to the question of intent. She placed the Facebook message printout in the center of the table. The silence that followed was specific, the kind that happens when something enters a room and everyone understands immediately what it means. Christina looked at the printout. Her face did not change, but her hands, folded on the table, went very still. Daniel looked at it, then at Christina. In that 2-second exchange, the whole shape of their arrangement became visible. The way she had driven this, the way he had followed, the way he now looked at his wife with something that was not quite accusation, but was its near neighbor. "Where did you get that?" Christina said, not a question. "A semi-public communication, authenticated with full chain of custody," Catherine said pleasantly. Gerald Park leaned over to read it. He read it once, sat back, said nothing. "This is taken out of context," Christina said. Over-precise now, managing something sharp inside her. "We have the complete thread," Catherine said. Daniel put his hand flat on the table. "Mom." He was looking at me, not Christina. "Intentional." He said the word slowly. "She said the seating was intentional." "She did," I agreed. "You told me it was a mistake," he said to Christina. "You said the table filled up." "Daniel." Her voice was low, warning. "You told me she'd been acting confused, that the best thing was to be patient." He was reading the printout more carefully now, his face doing something difficult. "And meanwhile, you were writing to your sister that the more isolated she felt." He stopped, put the paper down, looked at the table. The room was quiet. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was grief, not for what had been done to me, but for what had been done to him. Because Daniel was not an innocent man, but he had also been managed, used, and that knowledge was not simple. Gerald Park called a short recess. During the recess, I sat in the small kitchen and drank a glass of water. Catherine stood beside me. "He didn't know all of it," I said quietly. "No," she said. "I don't think he did." We went back in. Christina did not speak again. She sat composed, whatever she was thinking kept entirely to herself. Gerald Park said his clients wished to discuss terms. Catherine told him what I was seeking: formal documentation of the loan, a signed acknowledgement that no power of attorney proceedings had been initiated, and nothing further, provided both conditions were met within 30 days. I was not seeking to destroy my son. I was seeking to protect myself. As they left, Daniel paused at the door. He looked at me, not at Christina, at me, and said, with the flat weight of something he needed to say, "I'm sorry, Mom." I held his gaze. "I know," I said. Gerald Park called Catherine on January 12th. His clients were prepared to accept the terms. All of them. Catherine called me immediately. I was in the garden despite the cold, and I sat on the stone bench near the rose bushes and listened to her read Gerald's exact language. Full acknowledgement of the $140,000 as a personal loan. Repayment beginning April 1st. $12,000 annually over 12 years, with a lump sum option available. Signed affidavit from both Daniel and Christina confirming that no power of attorney proceedings had been initiated and that no such steps would be taken without my written, witnessed, voluntary consent. And one additional item I had not requested, a formal written apology, signed by both of them, acknowledging that the Thanksgiving seating had been deliberate and that certain communications had been inappropriate and hurtful. Catherine told me it had been Daniel's addition. Christina had agreed she had no real option, but the requirement had been his. The signing took place on January 16th at Catherine's office. I arrived in the gray suit I used to wear to court. Daniel came without Christina. Separate cars, which told me something about the state of things between them. Christina signed where Gerald indicated and did not look at me. Daniel signed the apology last. He held the pen a moment before putting it to paper. When he set it down, he looked at me. "I'd like to see you," he said, "if you're willing." "I'm willing," I said, "but slowly." He nodded. Slowly. What happened to Christina afterward was not something I engineered. I did not share the Facebook message publicly. I did not pursue a defamation claim, though Catherine said the circumstances might have supported one. But consequences arrive without invitations. The message had been seen. It emerged in the weeks after the settlement, by two of Christina's friends from the gym. Word moved through small social circles, and by February, Christina had become the kind of person others were slightly careful around. More concretely, she had been in line for a senior promotion at her firm. In February, she did not receive it. I noted it and put it away. The repayment plan began in April, on schedule. The first transfer arrived on April 1st, and I moved it immediately to Emma's education fund. I planned to do that with every payment. I revised my will one final time in March. Emma's fund was now a standalone protected trust that neither of her parents could access before Emma reached adulthood. Emma would receive a letter at 18 explaining its existence. I hoped by then the context would be distant history. The day the final documents were filed, I drove to the small beach on the Sound where Robert and I had stumbled onto happiness by accident 40 years before. I sat on a driftwood log in the early spring cold and watched the water. I was not a woman who had destroyed her family. I was a woman who had refused to let her family be destroyed by people who confused love with leverage. There is a difference, and it matters. I drove home and made dinner and ate at my own table, in my own house. It was enough. Spring came early that year, and I let it. I repainted the garden shed in April, a project I had been putting off for 3 years. A deep green that reminded me of the hills in Vermont where Robert and I honeymooned. I hired a college student named Marcus from the neighborhood, and while he handled the high work, I did the trim, and we talked about his plans for a semester abroad. By the time the shed was finished, I had made a decision. I would go back to Lisbon in September. I had not traveled alone since Robert died. I had told myself solo travel was impractical, the kind of thing that invited fretting from Daniel that I had always tried to forestall. But Daniel's opinion of my capabilities had been, I now understood, irrelevant to my actual capabilities. And I was 68, not 88, and I had never needed permission to get on a plane. I booked the ticket in May, direct flight, business class, because I had earned it. Linda came to see the shed and approved of the color. We had started a small weekly reading group. 4 women from the neighborhood, Wednesday evenings, wine and books they'd actually read, or sometimes hadn't. It had become one of the most reliable pleasures of my week. I had let that kind of easy companionship go. The way you let things go when a child's needs fill the space where other things used to live, and then the child grows, and you forget to reclaim what you gave up. I reclaimed it. I also began volunteering 2 mornings a week at a legal aid clinic downtown. Work I had always told myself I would do when I had time and had then found reasons to defer. An older woman with 30 years of contract law experience is not useless in a room full of people who cannot afford an attorney. I was useful, specifically and concretely, in a way that reminded me who I had been before I became primarily someone's mother. I saw Daniel once a month. We met for lunch at a diner near the old neighborhood. Neutral territory, comfortable. The lunches were quiet at first, careful in the way of two people who have walked through something together and are not yet sure how to stand in the aftermath. But they grew easier. He asked about the legal aid clinic, and his questions were real. He told me things about his work. Once in July, we talked about his father in the ordinary way you talk about someone you both actually knew and missed. It was the best conversation we'd had in years. He never brought Christina. I did not ask about her. Emma and I had our own arrangement. Every other Sunday I picked her up and we had the day, the library, baking, or the small science museum where she had developed a passionate interest in marine biology. She explained to me with great seriousness that crabs were smarter than hamsters, and this was simply a scientific fact. I told her to write that down for her teacher. She laughed. I lived for those Sundays, and whatever else that year had taken from me, it had not taken Emma. As for Christina, the promotion she had not received in February remained unreceived. By summer, she had quietly left the firm for a less senior position across town. The marriage was harder to read from the outside, but by late spring it was clear from small things. The extra half-hour Daniel sat after lunch plates were cleared, the brevity with which he answered questions about home, that things between them were in serious trouble. In September, he told me they were in couples counseling. I said I was glad they were getting support. I did not say what I thought about whether it would help. When I boarded my plane to Lisbon in the first week of September, I was carrying a single rolling suitcase, an unstarted novel, my mother's recipe for a custard tart, and approximately none of the weight I had been carrying since November. Lisbon was warm and tilted and smelling of salt and roasting coffee. I checked into a small hotel near the Alfama district and walked out into the October light without a destination. Turning down whatever street seemed interesting, finding the river eventually, sitting at a cafe table above the water with a glass of wine I had not earned and did not need to earn. I stayed for 10 days. I came home to a house that was mine, in a life that was mine, built by someone who had spent 68 years working to deserve it. That felt like enough. More than enough. Like the right ending and the right beginning at exactly the same time. They say with age comes wisdom. I think what actually comes is experience. Wisdom is what you choose to do with it. I could have wept in that corner with my child's chair and my pecan pie. Instead, I opened a notes app and started thinking like a lawyer. No one has the right to make you small in your own story. Document everything. Trust people who tell you hard truths. Know what you own. I was 68 years old, and I was not finished. Not even close. What would you have done in that corner? Tell me in the comments. Share this if it reached something in you. Someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. My husband left me at 73 for a 35-year-old woman. You're old and sick, he said. I just smirked. He didn't know that. 2 years ago, I quietly transferred all the accounts. On the day of the trial, I showed the judge. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me when I first knew. They expect me to say it was the lipstick on his collar, or a strange perfume, or a phone left carelessly on the kitchen counter. But the truth is quieter than that. The truth came to me on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in my own kitchen in Charlottesville, Virginia, watching my husband of 48 years eat his oatmeal and not once look up at me. Donald and I had built something real together. I want you to understand that before anything else. We were not a fairy tale. No marriage lasting nearly 5 decades ever is. But we were solid. I had taught 8th grade English at Monticello Middle School for 31 years. Donald had run a small but respected civil engineering firm. We raised 2 children, buried 1 dog, survived 1 recession, and remodeled the kitchen twice. Our house on Sycamore Lane had a wraparound porch where we drank coffee every Sunday morning without fail. I thought that porch was a promise. I thought a lot of things. The first signal came in the spring before everything fell apart. Donald began going to the gym. Now, I want to be fair. A man of 76 taking an interest in his health is not a crime. I even encouraged it at first. But this was different. He bought new running shoes, then new shirts. Then he started leaving the house on Saturday mornings with a gym bag and coming back 2 hours later without a trace of sweat on him. I noticed. I am a woman who spent 3 decades teaching teenagers to think critically. I noticed everything. By summer, he had a new phone. A second one, he told me, for work. Donald had been retired for 4 years. I did not confront him then. Perhaps I should have. But I had learned, over the long years of our marriage, that confronting Donald without evidence was like arguing with fog. He would simply deny, deflect, and leave the room, and I would be left standing there feeling foolish and small. So instead, I watched. I listened. I began paying attention to the small architecture of our days together. What had changed, what had disappeared, what had been quietly replaced. He stopped asking about my book club. He had always teased me about my book club, called it the Wine and Gossip Society, and I had always laughed. That small, familiar teasing vanished sometime in July, and in its place came a distant politeness that was somehow worse than rudeness. He passed me the salt without being asked. He said thank you when I set his dinner on the table. We were becoming strangers who shared a house, and the courtesy of it was unbearable. Our daughter, Susan, came to visit in August with her family from Richmond. I watched Donald at the dinner table, animated, laughing, pouring wine, telling stories about his old projects. And then I watched him check his phone under the table 3 times during dessert. Susan didn't notice, or maybe she did, and said nothing. Families are very good at not noticing the things that frighten them. It was in September that I first followed him. I am not proud of it, but I will not pretend it didn't happen. I told him I was going to my friend Ruth's house for lunch, drove around the block, and parked 2 streets over. Then I walked. He left 20 minutes later in his car, dressed in a blue button-down shirt I had never seen before. I followed on foot as far as I could, and I watched him park outside a coffee shop on Water Street and walk inside with the ease of a man who had done it many times. I stood on that sidewalk for a long moment. The October air was sharp and clean. A woman with a stroller passed me. A yellow leaf fell from a maple and landed on my shoe. And I thought, how many Tuesday mornings have there been that I do not know about? I went home. I made tea. I sat on the wraparound porch that I had once thought was a promise, and I waited for him to come back. He came back at 4 o'clock, smelling of a different soap, and walked past me into the house without stopping to sit beside me, without asking about my lunch with Ruth, without even looking at the porch. And 2 weeks later, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table, folded his hands the way he always did when he had made a decision, and said the words I had already been preparing myself to hear. Margaret, he said. He only used my full name when something was serious. I want a divorce. I looked at him. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 48 years, the father of my children, the person I had driven to the hospital at 2 in the morning when his back went out, the man I had nursed through a knee replacement and a bout of pneumonia in 2019. I've met someone, he said. He had the decency, at least, to hold my gaze. Her name is Crystal. She's 35. I know how this sounds. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, almost gently, "How long?" 2 years, he said. 2 years. While I was gardening and going to book club and making his oatmeal and sitting on that porch. 2 years. Then he said it. The thing I will never forget as long as I live. He looked at me across the kitchen table, the table where we had shared 10,000 meals. And he said, with a kind of tired impatience, as though I was a problem he had finally decided to stop managing, "Margaret, you're old and you're sick. What do you want me to do?" I had been diagnosed with mild arthritis in my hips 2 years earlier. It slowed me down some mornings. It did not define me. But he had been keeping that sentence in reserve, I realized, saving it, sharpening it, for exactly this moment. I looked at him for a long time, and then slowly, I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt like nothing I can properly describe. But I smiled because 2 years ago, when his attitude had first begun to change, I had done something quiet and careful and entirely legal, and Donald had no idea. He mistook my smile for defeat. He pushed back his chair and stood up, relieved that the hard part was over. It had not even begun. He left the kitchen. I stayed at the table. I sat there for perhaps an hour. The tea went cold. The light in the kitchen shifted from afternoon gold to the flat gray of early evening, and I did not move. I was not frozen by grief, exactly, though grief was there, heavy and real, sitting in my chest like a stone I would carry for a long time. I was doing something else. I was taking inventory. 48 years. I ran through them the way you might run your hand slowly across the spines of books on a shelf you know by heart. The early years in the small apartment on Maple Avenue when we had almost no money and laughed about it. The birth of our son, Thomas, in 1978, and then Susan in 1981. Thomas's accident in 2003, the car crash on Ashir 64, the weeks in the hospital, the grief that nearly broke both of us and somehow, instead, fused us together tighter. Or so I had believed. I thought about the house. Donald's name was on the deed because in 1987, when we refinanced, the mortgage broker had suggested it made more financial sense given Donald's income. I had agreed without a second thought. I was teaching school. I trusted my husband. I thought we were the same person, in the way married people sometimes do. Dangerously, foolishly, the same. I thought about our savings. Donald had always managed the finances. I had let him because I was busy, because I trusted him, because that was simply how things had been arranged, and I had never thought to rearrange them. There was a joint checking account. There were investment accounts in his name. There was a retirement fund. There was the house, worth roughly $680,000 in the current Charlottesville market. And there was the other thing, the thing Donald did not know about. Because here is what he had missed in his 2 years of Saturday coffees with Crystal Burns and his new shirts and his second phone. He had missed the moment 24 months earlier when I had first become afraid. It had not started as certainty. It had started as a feeling, the kind of low, persistent unease that women of my generation were trained to dismiss as anxiety or imagination. But I had been a teacher for 31 years. I knew the difference between anxiety and instinct. And my instinct, sometime in the autumn 2 years ago, had told me to be careful. So I had been careful. Quietly, methodically, without drama. I had made an appointment with a financial advisor in Waynesboro, far enough from Charlottesville that I was unlikely to run into anyone we knew. Her name was Patricia Odom, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had heard my story before I even finished telling it. She had helped me understand what I had rights to, what I could legally move, and what I should document. I had spent 2 years documenting, But sitting at that kitchen table in the October dark, I was honest with myself about one thing. I was afraid. Not of Donald, exactly. He had never been a physically threatening man. I was afraid of the machinery of divorce at 73. I was afraid of lawyers and courtrooms and the particular humiliation of having your life sorted through by strangers. I was afraid of being alone in a way I had not been since I was 22 years old. I was afraid that the world would look at me, old and arthritic and discarded, and find me pitiable. And underneath that fear was something sharper. Fury. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold kind. The kind that doesn't shout. It calculates. I got up from the table. I washed my teacup. I went to the small writing desk in the spare bedroom, the room Donald never entered anymore, and I opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a folder. Inside the folder were documents, bank statements, records of transfers, and the card of a family law attorney in Richmond named Howard Breck, whom Patricia had recommended 8 months ago when things had progressed from feeling to near certainty. I had not called Howard Breck yet. I had been waiting to see if I was wrong. I was not wrong. I picked up my phone and I wrote him an email. It was 7:14 in the evening. I told him I was ready to proceed, that the separation had been initiated by my husband that evening, and that I would like to schedule a consultation at his earliest convenience. I used the same tone I had once used writing to school administrators. Clear, factual, without emotional inflation. Then I went back to the folder. Virginia is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly, though not necessarily equally. The law considers many factors: length of the marriage, contributions of each spouse, economic circumstances. 48 years, 2 children, 1 income I had supplemented for decades while also managing our entire domestic life. These were facts. These were my facts, and they were powerful. But the most important thing in that folder was this. 2 years ago, with Patricia's guidance and the help of a separate estate attorney, I had converted a portion of my own assets, money I had inherited from my mother in 2018, money that was legally mine alone, into accounts held solely in my name. I had also begun keeping a meticulous record of all household expenses I personally paid, all contributions I had made to our joint financial life that were not reflected in the joint accounts. Donald had access to the joint accounts. He did not have access to my mother's inheritance. He had never asked about it. In 48 years, he had never once asked what happened to the $94,000 my mother left me. I had invested it carefully, and it had grown. That was not my plan. That was simply my foundation, the solid ground beneath my feet when everything else had been pulled away. My plan was something else. I sat at the writing desk with a legal pad, and I began to write. Not in anger, but with the focused clarity of a woman who had spent 31 years teaching children to organize their thoughts. I wrote down what I knew. I wrote down what I could prove. I wrote down what Donald would expect me to do. Collapse, weep, accept whatever he offered, disappear quietly into a small apartment somewhere, and be grateful. And then, on a separate line, I wrote what I was actually going to do. I would not collapse. I would not accept. I would not disappear. I would walk into Howard Breck's office in Richmond with a folder that would make a very clear argument: that I had been a full partner in this marriage for 48 years, that I had financial and documentary evidence to support every claim I intended to make, and that Donald James Holloway should think very carefully before assuming that the woman he had just called old and sick across a kitchen table had nothing left to fight with. I closed the folder. I turned off the desk lamp. Down the hall, I could hear Donald on his phone, his second phone, speaking in a low voice. Speaking to her, I imagined, telling her it was done, that I had taken it quietly, that everything would be simple now. I almost felt sorry for them. almost. The drive to Richmond on a Thursday morning takes about an hour and 20 minutes from Charlottesville on DR 64, depending on traffic. I had made that drive hundreds of times over the years. For Susan's college visits, for Thomas's memorial service, for the occasional teachers' conference. I knew every curve of it. But that morning, in late October, driving alone with my folder on the passenger seat, the familiar highway felt different, purposeful, like I was finally moving in the right direction after standing still for a very long time. Howard Breck's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building near Carey Street, a quiet, serious space with law books and framed diplomas and the particular stillness of a place where people's lives are taken apart and examined. Howard himself was a man in his early 60s, compact and careful, with reading glasses he took on and off as he spoke. Patricia Odom had told me he was one of the best family law attorneys in Central Virginia. Within 15 minutes of our meeting, I understood why. He listened without interrupting. He looked through my folder, the statements, the records, the timeline I had compiled, and he did not try to reassure me or soften anything. He told me the truth, which was this. Virginia divorce law was on my side in several significant ways, but the process would not be quick, and it would not be without conflict. Donald would have his own attorney. There would be negotiations and likely a contested hearing about asset distribution. The house was the central battleground. "He's going to fight for the house," Howard said, "or he's going to try to buy you out at a number well below fair market value." "I know," I said. "I won't accept that." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "Good. Then let's talk about what you have." What I had was this: nearly 5 decades of marriage in which I had contributed financially, domestically, and emotionally to every asset Donald now considered his. I had records. I had Patricia's documentation. And I had something Howard found particularly useful: a detailed log I had been keeping for 2 years of Donald's increasingly separate financial behavior, including several large withdrawals from our joint account that I had not been informed of and could not account for. When I told Howard about the withdrawals, $4,000 in March, $3,500 in June, $2,800 in August, he wrote them down carefully. "Do you know what he used that money for?" he asked. "I have a reasonable suspicion," I said. Howard nodded. "We'll need more than suspicion." I nodded back. "I know." The first official step was filed that same afternoon. Howard submitted a notice of intent to contest the divorce and petition for equitable distribution of marital assets. It was a formal document, dry and legal, but it meant something real. I was not going to accept whatever Donald chose to offer. I was going to make him prove his case in front of a judge. By the time I drove back to Charlottesville that evening, the document had been served. I learned later from Susan, who heard from a neighbor in the small interconnected way of a community where people have lived for decades, that Donald's reaction when the papers arrived was not calm. He had been on the phone within minutes, not with his own attorney, whom he had already quietly retained, but with Crystal. That told me something. A man who is simply ending a marriage hires a lawyer and waits for the process. A man who is panicking calls the person he has been protecting. I filed that information away. Meanwhile, something shifted in the house on Sycamore Lane. Donald had been sleeping in the guest room since the night of our conversation, which suited me fine. But in the days after the papers were served, his behavior changed. He became watchful. He began coming home earlier than he had in months, as if he needed to monitor something. He went through the mail before I could get to it. Once, I came into the kitchen to find him standing at the desk in the corner, looking at a stack of papers. And he straightened quickly when he saw me, with the particular guilty speed of a person who has just been caught doing something they have not decided to admit to yet. "Looking for something?" I asked. "Just the electric bill," he said. I smiled and went to make coffee. What he was looking for, I believe, was evidence of what I had already moved, what I had already done. He was beginning to understand that there was a version of this situation he had not planned for. Good. The proof I had been waiting for came not from a private investigator or a dramatic confrontation, but from a very ordinary source, our credit card statement. I had, technically, access to all our joint financial accounts. Donald had stopped reviewing the monthly statements with me, had stopped reviewing them at all, I suspect, because he had been managing certain expenses through the joint account with more carelessness than he realized. In November's statement, which I retrieved online at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, while Donald was in the guest room on his second phone, I found the following: 2 charges at a jeweler in Short Pump, a Richmond suburb, totaling $2,340, made in July. A restaurant in Richmond I did not recognize, charged 3 times over 5 months. A hotel in Staunton, Virginia, for 2 nights in September. The same weekend he had told me he was visiting his college friend Ray in Roanoke. I printed the statement. I added it to my folder. Then I sat back in my chair and thought about the hotel in Staunton, about a night in September when I had been alone in this house, feeding our cat, reading my book, assuming my husband was visiting an old friend, while he was 40 minutes away in a hotel room with a 35-year-old woman. Did he think I was too old to figure it out? Did he think the arthritis in my hips had somehow spread to my mind? I was, in fact, sharper than I had been at 40. Grief has a way of clarifying things. I called Howard Breck the next morning. I told him about the statement. He told me it was exactly the kind of documentation that would matter in court, not because adultery automatically shifts asset division in Virginia, but because those withdrawals and charges told a story about marital funds being spent on the affair without my knowledge or consent. In Virginia, dissipation of marital assets is taken seriously. "How much time do we have before the hearing?" I asked. "At the current pace, likely 4 to 5 months, Howard said. 4 to 5 months. Long enough to gather everything I needed. Long enough to let Donald believe he was managing the situation. I thanked Howard and hung up. Then I went out to the wraparound porch with my coffee, sat in my usual chair, and watched the November light fall across the yard I had tended for 30 years. The roses needed cutting back. The oak at the far end of the garden had lost most of its leaves. I would take care of the roses next spring, I decided. In my house. On my porch. There was no version of this in which I lost that porch. In December, Howard Breck made a formal discovery request. This is standard procedure in contested divorce. Each side is legally required to disclose all assets, accounts, property, and financial records. It is also, in many cases, the moment when a spouse who has been hiding something begins to sweat. Donald hired his own attorney. His name was Greg Sutter. I found this out through Susan, who had received an awkward phone call from her father asking her not to take sides. Susan had called me immediately afterward, shaking with anger, and I had told her calmly that I didn't need her to take sides. I just needed her to know the truth. She had driven up from Richmond the following Saturday and sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours while I told her everything. She cried. I handed her tissues and waited for her to finish, the way I had waited out her teenage storms 30 years ago. "Mom," she said finally, "did you know? Before he told you?" "I suspected," I said. "That's why I prepared." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from grief to something else. Something that looked, quietly, like respect. The discovery process ground forward through December. Howard submitted the requests. Greg Sutter filed responses. I submitted my own disclosures. Everything legally required, thoroughly documented, with supporting records attached. My mother's inheritance, now in a separate account, was disclosed as separate property, clearly traced back to the original estate transfer in 2018. Separate property is not subject to equitable distribution in Virginia. It was mine, and the paper trail was airtight. What was subject to distribution was everything else: the house, the joint investment accounts, Donald's retirement fund accumulated during our marriage, the joint savings. The total picture, once the discovery documents were compiled, was considerable. I will not say the number here. What I will say is that when Greg Sutter received our full financial disclosure and passed it to Donald, something changed in the house on Sycamore Lane. Donald stopped being watchful and distant. He became something else. He became, for the first time in our conflict, openly hostile. It started on a Wednesday evening in mid-December. I was in the kitchen when he came in from the guest room with a paper in his hand, a page from the discovery documents, and put it on the table in front of me. His face was a color I recognized from our few serious arguments over the years, a dark, congested red. "What is this?" he said. "That appears to be a financial disclosure form," I said. I did not look up from the vegetable soup I was stirring. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't be cute. You have been deliberately hiding assets." "I disclosed everything required by law," I said. "If you'd like to dispute any of it, you're welcome to raise it through your attorney." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Patricia Odom, you've been seeing a financial advisor for 2 years." "Yes," I said, "while we were still married." "We are still married," I said, "until the court says otherwise." He left the kitchen. I finished the soup. The call from Crystal came the next day. This surprised me. Not that she would call, but that she would call so soon, so directly, without pretense. She had gotten my number from Donald's phone, I assumed. She was direct. I'll give her that. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "I think it would be better for everyone if this was handled without going to court." "I'm sure you do," I said. "Donald just wants to move on. He's not trying to leave you with nothing. But the way your attorney is approaching this, it's going to be expensive and painful for everyone, including you." "Crystal," I said, and I used her name carefully, the way I used to say the names of students who needed to understand I was paying attention. "I spent 48 years building what you are now hoping to benefit from. I intend to make sure the court understands exactly what those 48 years were worth. Have a pleasant evening." I hung up. 40 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was a number I didn't recognize. An attorney's office, it turned out, not Greg Sutter, but a second attorney, a woman named Diane Marsh. She spoke quickly and with a professional warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes, I imagined. "Mrs. Holloway, I represent Crystal Burns. I want to be very clear. My client has reason to believe that certain financial documents may have been improperly handled in the preparation of your disclosure. If the current approach continues, we may be compelled to request a forensic financial audit, which would be expensive and time-consuming for all parties." "Request whatever you feel is appropriate," I said. "My records are complete." "We also want you to be aware," she continued, her voice dropping half a register, "that there are aspects of your own financial history during this marriage that may not reflect favorably upon you in front of a judge." I was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, "Are you threatening me?" A brief pause. "I'm making you aware of the full picture." "Thank you for calling," I said, and hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a few minutes after that, and I will not pretend my hands were entirely steady. The threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable, had landed. What aspects of my financial history? What did they think they had? Nothing. They had nothing, because there was nothing. But a threat does not need to be grounded in truth to be frightening. It only needs to make you doubt yourself. I called Howard immediately. He listened to my account of both calls with the focused quiet of a man who has heard this before. "They're rattled," he said simply. "This is what rattled people do. They apply pressure and hope you blink." I won't blink, I said. I know. But take the weekend, Margaret. Rest. You've been carrying a great deal. This process has a long way still to go, and you'll need your strength for the parts that matter. I took his advice. That weekend, I drove to Richmond to stay with Susan. We didn't talk about the divorce much. We watched 2 old movies, cooked a lamb dinner on Saturday evening, and on Sunday morning, walked along the James River in the cold December air while her children ran ahead of us along the path. My granddaughter, Lily, she was 8, with Susan's same stubborn chin, took my hand without being asked and held it the whole way back to the car. I thought about the phone call. I thought about Crystal's smooth, careful voice. I thought about Donald's red face over the kitchen table. By the time I drove back to Charlottesville on Sunday evening, the fear had settled into something smaller and quieter. Something I could carry without it carrying me. The next phase was coming. I needed to be ready. January came in cold and flat. The rose bushes in the front garden were cut back to stubs, the oak leafless, the street quiet. I had lived long enough to understand that January is not a kind month. It strips everything back and shows you what is actually there. That winter, what was actually there was a house in the middle of a legal proceeding, an almost ex-husband sleeping 12 feet down the hall, and the knowledge that the next few months would determine the rest of my life. I had expected silence from Donald and Crystal after the December phone calls. I was wrong. In the second week of January, Greg Sutter contacted Howard with what was framed as a settlement offer. Howard called me from his Richmond office and read it to me in the careful, neutral tone of a lawyer presenting options rather than recommendations. Donald proposed the following. He would take the house and pay me a buyout of $180,000. He would retain his retirement fund. The joint investment accounts would be split 60-40 in his favor, given, as the offer letter stated, the primary nature of his financial contributions throughout the marriage. I would receive my separate property, my mother's inheritance, without contest, and there would be a clause requiring both parties to make no public statements about the circumstances of the divorce. I listened to all of it without speaking. When Howard finished, there was a short silence, and then he said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that $180,000 for half a $680,000 house after 48 years is an insult dressed up as generosity." "It is," Howard said. "I want to be transparent with you. If we go to a contested hearing, there are no guarantees. But based on the documentation we have, your position is strong." "Reject it," I said, politely and completely. There was another quality to this offer that I did not mention to Howard, though I turned it over in my mind for several days afterward. The silence clause. No public statements about the circumstances of the divorce. That told me something. They were worried, not just about the money, but about the story, about what I might say, and to whom, and how it might reflect on Donald in this community where he had lived and worked and been respected for 50 years. I had no interest in a public campaign. I had never been a person who settled scores through gossip, but the fact that they wanted my silence told me my silence had value. I filed that knowledge away. In the third week of January, Howard suggested I connect with a support group, not for emotional processing, as he carefully put it, but for practical reasons. Women who've been through this process have information and perspective that can be genuinely useful, he said. And frankly, Margaret, isolation at this stage doesn't serve you. I was skeptical. I had always been a private person, and the idea of sitting in a circle discussing my marriage felt undignified. But Howard was right about most things, and I was honest enough to admit that the weeks since December had been lonely in a way I had not anticipated. The group met every other Wednesday evening at a community center in Charlottesville. 6 women, ranging in age from late 40s to mid-70s, all in various stages of divorce or post-divorce. The facilitator was a social worker named Diane Chen, who had the calm, watchful manner of someone who had learned to be present without intervening. I expected to feel out of place. I did not. The woman who mattered most to me in that group was Barbara Kimmel, 68 years old, a retired pharmacist from Crozet who had finalized her own divorce 2 years earlier after a 35-year marriage. She had the bearing of a woman who had been through a fire and come out the other side with all the unnecessary things burned away. We had coffee after the second meeting at a diner on Route 250, and she told me things about the divorce process that no lawyer tells you, the emotional tricks the opposing side uses, the moments when you will be most tempted to give in, the specific way fatigue and loneliness can make a bad settlement look like relief. The worst moment, she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup, was when my ex's attorney told me I was being unreasonable, that I was making things harder on myself, that a woman my age should be thinking about simplicity. She paused. I almost believed him. That's what they want. They want you to believe that wanting what is fair is somehow excessive. Did any of them ever stop to consider that the women they were calling unreasonable had simply decided to stop being reasonable on everyone else's behalf? I thought about that for a long time. Barbara also connected me, practically and without fuss, with a forensic accountant she had used during her own proceedings, a man named Frank Corelli in Waynesboro, who specialized in tracing marital financial records. Howard had already suggested this. Barbara's recommendation confirmed it. I called Frank the following week, and we began working through Donald's financial records together, looking carefully at those withdrawals, those hotel charges, the jewelry receipts. What Frank found took several weeks to document fully, but the picture it began to paint was this. Over approximately 26 months, Donald had spent somewhere in the range of $31,000 in marital funds on the relationship with Crystal Burns. Dinners, hotels, jewelry, 2 weekend trips. Small amounts individually, significant collectively, and, critically, every dollar had come from accounts that were subject to equitable distribution. This is called dissipation of marital assets. In Virginia, a judge can consider it when dividing property. Donald had paid for his affair with our money. I sat with that fact for a while. Then I added Frank's preliminary findings to my folder and went on with my week. The Wednesday group met again on the last day of January. It was snowing lightly when I drove there, the streets quiet and white, the city soft and muffled. I sat in my usual chair and listened to the other women talk, and when it was my turn, I said simply that things were progressing, that I had good people around me, that I was not afraid. It was almost true. The fear was still there, small and persistent, like a stone in a shoe. But something else had grown up around it. A network of people who understood what I was doing and why. Howard, Patricia, Frank, Barbara, Susan, the Wednesday group. I was not alone. Donald had apparently expected me to be alone. He had left me at 73 with the unspoken assumption that loneliness would do what argument could not. Wear me down, soften my position, make me reach for the nearest settlement just to end the uncertainty. He had miscalculated, in this as in so much else. The hearing date was set for late March, 8 weeks away. I went home through the snow, made chamomile tea, and sat at my writing desk to review Frank's latest findings. The folder was thick now. Everything in it was true, documented, and ready. 8 weeks. 6 weeks before the hearing, Donald asked if he could speak with me. Not through Greg Sutter, not through a formal channel. He knocked on the door of the spare bedroom on a Sunday afternoon and asked with careful politeness if I had a few minutes. I told him to come in and waited. He sat in the armchair in the corner and looked older than he had in December. The brisk certainty of a man who had already decided how things would go had been replaced by something more cautious. "I don't want this to get ugly," he said, like a man making a magnanimous statement. "It already is ugly, Donald," I said. "You made it ugly in October." He absorbed that. Then, "Crystal and I just want to move forward. We're not trying to take anything from you that's rightfully yours." "The court will make that determination," I said. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Howard Breck is running up your legal fees, Margaret. He has an interest in keeping this contested. Is that really what you want? To spend the next year in litigation, paying attorneys for what? To make a point?" "To receive what I am owed," I said. "That's not a point. That's a fact." Then he tried the approach I had been most prepared for. His voice softened in a way that might have been genuine concern or very good performance. "You're not well. The stress of this, the legal process, the uncertainty, it's not good for you at your age. Your hip has been worse this winter." "My hip." He was using my hip as an argument. "My hip is managed," I said. "My health is not your concern." I let the moment sit. The 48 years were real. The shared grief over Thomas was real. The Sunday mornings on the porch had been real. But the man using my arthritis as leverage for why I should accept less than I was owed, that man was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and carrying that double truth was exhausting. "If that's everything, Donald, I have work to do." He didn't move. Then he tried one more thing. "Crystal has a connection," he said carefully. "A mutual acquaintance of Judge Harmon's. She's not suggesting anything improper, just that she knows someone who could put in a word about the kind of person you are." The room was very quiet. I looked at my husband of 48 years with a terrible clarity. Not anger, not grief, but the absolute recognition of who he had become. "If anyone connected to you or Crystal attempts inappropriate contact with Judge Harmon or any officer of that court," I said, "Howard Breck will file for sanctions within the hour. I will report it to the Virginia State Bar, and that specific story will be the first thing I discuss when anyone asks about this divorce." I paused. "Do you understand me?" His face went through several colors. "I wasn't suggesting, Donald, do you understand me?" He stood, straightened his shirt, and walked out. I sat very still after the door closed. My heart was moving faster than I wanted. Crystal had sent him in with a script. I was fairly sure of it. The soft opening about moving forward, the concern about my health, building to that final veiled suggestion. I called Howard the next morning. He made a formal note and sent a letter to Greg Sutter that same afternoon. Sutter called back, claiming his client had no idea what we were talking about. Of course he didn't. I called Barbara on Wednesday. "The pity play followed by the threat," she said immediately. "Classic. Mine did exactly the same thing." "What did you do?" "Documented it and kept going, which is what you're going to do." The fear from that Sunday never entirely left me in the weeks that followed, but I stopped fighting it and started using it. Fear is information. It tells you what has value, what needs protecting. I was afraid because I had something worth fighting for. That was not a reason to stop. It was a reason to walk into that courtroom ready. 2 weeks. The hearing was on a Tuesday in late March. I wore my charcoal wool suit, bought for Thomas's memorial service, worn only once since. It seemed right. I drove myself to Richmond, arrived 40 minutes early, and sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes with my hands in my lap, just breathing. Howard met me in the lobby. He looked at me, made a small nod. "You're ready." And we walked in together. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. Ordinary fluorescent lighting, wood-paneled walls, a raised bench where Judge Patricia Harmon sat. Not a man, as I had assumed. A woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain. who opened proceedings with the focused efficiency of someone with a full docket and no patience for theater. Donald was already there with Greg Sutter. He wore his dark blue suit, weddings, and funerals. He did not look at me. Howard presented first. He walked Judge Harmon through 48 years with calm precision. 31 years of my professional income, the domestic management that had freed Donald to build his career, the house appraised at $683,000, the joint investment accounts, Donald's retirement fund accumulated entirely during our marriage. Then he presented Frank Corelli's dissipation analysis. Frank's 2-page summary was methodical and devastating. The withdrawals, the credit card charges, the hotel in Staunton, the jewelry receipts from Short Pump, the Richmond restaurant charges. $31,420 drawn from marital accounts over 26 months. Howard did not editorialize. He didn't need to. Judge Harmon looked at the document, then at Greg Sutter. Counsel, does your client dispute these figures? Sutter stood, smooth but visibly effortful. Your Honor, my client acknowledges certain expenditures, but disputes the characterization as dissipation. The charges correlate with an extramarital relationship, Judge Harmon said, stating an observable fact. Is your client disputing the nature of the relationship? A pause. No, Your Honor. Then proceed. Sutter's argument came down to this. Donald had been the primary earner, his retirement fund was his professional achievement, and the $180,000 buyout represented fair resolution. Howard's response cited Virginia case law on equitable distribution in long-term marriages, the totality of spousal contribution, and the dissipation finding. Then Howard raised the settlement offer from January, specifically the silence clause. Your Honor, the offer included a provision requiring my client to make no public statements about the divorce. We would ask the court to note that such a provision reflects an acknowledgement of conduct the opposing party wished to limit public knowledge of. Sutter objected. Harmon noted it and made her own note. It was not the most dramatic moment of the morning. It was the most quietly devastating. Sutter's cross-examination challenged Frank's methodology on 2 points: alternative explanations for the withdrawals, other interpretations of the charges. Howard laid out the supporting documentation one by one: receipts, booking confirmations, the hotel loyalty record in Donald's name. Donald, beside his attorney, was very still. Once I glanced at him, only once, and he was staring at the table with the fixed expression of a man who has understood that the story he believed he was in has become a different story entirely. Was this the moment he realized what I had meant back in October when I smiled? Sutter made one final attempt, arguing with controlled eloquence that Margaret Holloway was a woman of significant independent means and that Donald had not anticipated a sophisticated financial strategy being deployed against him. Judge Harmon looked at him over her reading glasses. Counsel, your client spent $31,000 of marital funds on an extramarital relationship without his wife's knowledge, proposed a settlement awarding her 26% of the marital home's value, and included a confidentiality clause in that offer. You're characterizing her preparation for these proceedings as a strategy deployed against him. Sutter opened his mouth and closed it. I'll have my ruling within 3 weeks. We're adjourned. Howard gathered his papers without hurry. I sat still for a moment, my folder in front of me, my suit exactly as neat as when I arrived. Outside on the courthouse steps, March sun on my face. Howard said quietly, "That went as well as it could have gone." "Yes," I said. "It did." 3 weeks for the ruling. I had waited 48 years. I could wait 3 weeks. The ruling came in 17 days. Howard called on a Thursday afternoon at 2:30. I was in the garden, cutting back deadwood from the rose bushes, the ones I had promised myself I would tend in the spring, in my house, on my terms. I pulled off my gardening gloves and listened. Judge Patricia Harmon had ruled in favor of equitable distribution weighted significantly toward my position. The house on Sycamore Lane was to be sold. Proceeds divided 65% to me and 35% to Donald. At $683,000, that meant approximately $443,950 to me, not a buyout at $180,000, not 26%. 65. The joint investment accounts. 55% to me, 45% to Donald. The dissipation finding cited as a factor. Donald's retirement fund was subject to a QDRO, entitling me to 38% of the marital portion, at the strong end of what Howard had expected. My mother's inheritance remained entirely mine, untouched. In total, more than 3 times what Donald had offered in January. I sat on the garden bench with the phone in my hand and stayed there a while. The roses were showing their first red buds, small, tight, determined. The oak was beginning to leaf. The April light was that particular gold of things that have been waiting. I called Susan. She picked up on the second ring. When I told her, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mom, just that." "I'm all right," I said. "I know you are," she said. "I've known that for months." Greg Sutter filed a motion to reconsider, arguing the dissipation finding had been given undue weight. Judge Harmon denied it inside a week, in the brief language of a judge who has said what she intends to say. One further attempt, mediation to revisit the QDRO calculation. Howard responded that my client had participated in good faith, received a ruling, and there was nothing to mediate. That was the end of it. The house sold in May, 11 days after listing, for $691,000. The wraparound porch, it turned out, was a selling point. My 65%, $448,150. At the closing, I signed with the black Parker ballpoint my students had given me in 2012, engraved with my name and teaching years. It felt right. Donald was not there. He had signed earlier that morning in a separate appointment. We did not see each other. I did not feel triumphant in the way I had sometimes imagined during those long winter nights. What I felt was something quieter, a restoration. As if something knocked out of alignment had been, not dramatically reversed, but carefully, legally, permanently set right. Howard's fees were paid. Frank Corelli's fees were paid. Patricia Odom received a handwritten note of thanks because she had been the first person to take me seriously 2 years earlier, when I had walked into her office in Waynesboro with nothing but a feeling and a question. I booked a room at an inn near the Blue Ridge Parkway for a week in June. I called Ruth. "Come with me," I said. "Obviously," she said. A final letter arrived from Crystal's attorney, Diane Marsh, carefully worded, stating her client wished to communicate there had been no intention to cause harm and hoped the matter could be considered resolved. I read it once, put it in the folder, did not respond. The matter had been resolved in the only place that matters, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, on the record. Donald James Holloway had walked into our marriage's dissolution believing he knew exactly who he was dealing with. A woman who was old and sick and alone, who would take what was offered because she had no other choice. He had been wrong on every count. I found my new home in September, a ground-floor condominium on the western edge of Charlottesville. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a private patio that got the morning sun. No wraparound porch. I had made my peace with that. This patio was smaller, more mine, without the weight of 48 years in every corner. I bought it outright. Deep red rose bushes from the garden center, set along the railing, blooming the following spring with the absolute indifference of plants to human drama. The first dinner party was in November. Ruth, Barbara Kimmel with her daughter, Susan with her husband, and Lily, who fell asleep on my shoulder before dessert, and my neighbor James from across the hall, a retired professor who argued about novels with genuine enthusiasm. I was teaching again, a writing workshop at the downtown library every other Saturday. 8 students. One was 26 and writing about her grandmother, and when she read her first draft aloud, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. I had forgotten how much I loved it. The Wednesday group continued for several more months. When I left it, I carried 4 friendships that have since become a sustaining part of my life. Barbara and I have lunch every few weeks. Her dry humor is genuinely funny, which is rarer than it should be. I went to the Blue Ridge Parkway with Ruth in June. 5 days, slow hikes, good wine. On the last evening, she asked, "Are you happy?" "I think I'm on my way," I said, "which is better than I expected." She raised her glass. We clinked. As for Donald and Crystal, small communities have their own circulation systems. They moved into a rental on the south side of Charlottesville. By autumn, the relationship was strained. Crystal had expected permanence and security. What she found was a man in his mid-70s whose assets had been significantly reduced by a ruling he hadn't anticipated, renting for the first time in decades, not easy to live with in the daily grind. The jewelry and hotel weekends are one thing. The Tuesday mornings are another. By the following spring, Crystal had moved out. I felt no triumph, only quiet recognition. The life Donald had dismantled ours to pursue had not been the life he imagined. The woman he called old and sick had been the more durable investment. Donald's health had deteriorated, Susan mentioned, with careful neutrality. His knee was giving him trouble. The apartment stairs were difficult. I was 74. My hip was managed. I walked 3 miles most mornings. I had students on Saturdays, friends for lunch, a granddaughter who called every Sunday. What is a good life? The one that looks complete from the outside, or the one that feels complete from the inside? The roses bloomed in April. I stood on the patio with my coffee and watched the first ones open, deep red against the pale morning sky. This is mine. It was enough. It was, in fact, quite a lot. So that is my story. The lesson is simple. Prepare before you need to. Not out of cynicism, but because preparation is self-respect. It is the quiet acknowledgement that your life has value that does not depend on anyone else's goodwill. Never underestimate what the truth can do when it is organized. What would you have done? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. And thank you, truly, for listening.